Well, hi, everyone. My name is Brad Massey, and I'm the Saunders Foundation Curator of Public History here at the Tampa Bay History Center. It's a fancy way to say that my primary job is to work with the team here to develop exhibits and content for the public, and then talk about all the great things that we do to the press. So we appreciate you being here today. And of course, I'm sure most of you know this person to my right. This is Rodney Kite-Powell, who is the director of the Touchstone Map Library and the head of the Curatorial and Collections Department here at the Tampa Bay History Center. So thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you all so much for being here.
So we wanted to do an experiment for today, and that's, Rodney and I were talking earlier this week, and a lot of people have preconceived notions of the 1920s, right? And we figured probably more than any other talk that we do, people are gonna come in here with ideas. And so that's why you were awkwardly asked if you have any questions when you came in. And a few of you actually wrote questions, so we figured we kind of do things in reverse order, and we'll see what questions you have in mind. And then you can watch Rodney and I flail around as we fail to answer your questions. So,
and if you all have questions afterward, of course, we can take questions at the end as well.
Yeah, we'll do a Q&A. But we thought we'd kick it off like that, and that would kind of give us an insight into y'all's mindset and kind of what you're thinking. So Rodney has two questions, and I have one. So you want to kick it off to me first? Okay. I think I just
Okay, sure, yeah, I will start. And we will start with the first one that we got. So please explain, Dr. Massey, how or if lax banking regulations fed the land boom.
The bankers should be able to do whatever they want. There should be unsecured loans, and they should be able to make money. That's the American dream, of course. Thank you. Next question.
Done. All right.
So a lot of you know, and that's probably why we got the question, there's incredibly lax banking standards. And things that we take for granted now, like the FDIC, which of course insures deposits, those don't come along until the New Deal era. And a lot of reasons they come later in the 1930s is because banking proved to be such a colossal failure in the 1920s. A bank that failed here in Tampa, the Citizens Trust Bank, fails colossally in 1929, and then it comes out that a lot of prominent people in Tampa had taken unsecured loans from the bank. And when it failed, one of the people was like, well, what are we supposed to do? Give, money to people that we aren't friends with? Well, no, the answer is you're not supposed to give money to your friends, in an unsecured manner, and people that are powerful in society. So the 1920s banking laxity, Rodney, I think had a lot to do with what we see at the end of the 1920s, and then, of course, the Great Depression.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
Great question.
So this was an interesting one. I would have a hard time with this one, but let's see how you do. Explain the purpose of blue sky laws.
Well, everything you said about banking is kind of applying, obviously applies to the 1920s, but the blue sky laws were actually applied by northern states for northern banks to prohibit their depositors with making investments in Florida real estate because there were so many people who were basically swindlers who were trying to get people to buy real estate that either didn't exist or was underwater, or in some cases that didn't even own and had no right to sell, that people were just pulling their money out of banks and investing it very unwisely in Florida real estate. And there's even examples of if I'm a swindler land dealer and Brad comes into my office and I'm trying to do the hard sell and it says, sir, for $1,000 I can sell you this 50 feet in paradise and it's going to be worth 10 times as much. And Brad can say as a way to kind of put me off, I'd love to, but I don't, of course, have $1,000 on me in my checkbook. I don't have a check right now to write you. And I would say, well, what bank do you do business with? And he'd say, I do, First National Bank of Philadelphia. And I'd open my drawer, and I would have a blank check from the First Bank of Philadelphia in my drawer. I had blank checks from banks all around the country. And I say, well, I just happen to have a check right here. So now you have no reason. So these northern banks were seeing these poor deals that are being made, and they're really kind of concerned about their depositors being fleeced. And so they urged their states to pass these blue sky laws. After the Great Depression, really after World War II, blue sky laws were expanded, and really now all 50 states have them that deal with unsecured securities and things like that, other unsecured investments. So again, similar to unsecured loans that were being doled out by banks in the 1920s. These blue sky laws were a way to, in effect, prohibit people from investing in unsecured securities and losing their money.
And in case you were guessing, the 1920s land boom and then the 2008 land collapse or the property collapse here in Tampa, people like to say history repeats itself. I always say it doesn't repeat itself, but it does have a tendency to follow the same pattern. And I think that's what we see with blue sky laws and banking regulations that ease up, and then there's a collapse, and then they tighten, and then they ease up. It's kind of the ebb and flow of capital here in the United States.
Yeah. And the ebb and flow with property values in Florida, certainly.
Absolutely.
And so the last question we have before we start our presentations, and we're going to kind of quiz each other as we go through these presentations, so that should be fun as well. But please, for a moment, and I know you talk a little bit about this in the exhibit, but right now, Brad, please talk a little bit about the suffragette women's right to vote in Tampa.
Oh, in Tampa specifically.
In Tampa.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm going to have to speak more generally.
You can.
So what happens with the women's right to vote, heading up to 1920, of course, you have the amendment, and then we have the women's right to vote in the United States. In the South in particular, there's a lot of resistance to the women's right to vote. Some of the first states that support women's right to vote are out west, places like Wyoming. And the reason they do that in part is because they have smaller populations. And so the more votes they garner, the more political power they can garner. Then it kind of spreads into the Northeast and parts of the Midwest. But the South is a real holdout when it comes to women's right to vote. So what we see in Tampa is, I don't think we see, unless I'm wrong, Rodney, women involved in the electoral process until after the National Amendment is actually passed.
Correct.
Yeah. I can tell you that Florida's pretty slow to the game when it comes to women's right to vote.
Yeah, women's right to do a lot of things.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And Prohibition, we'll talk about that. There's kind of like the alternate lag when it comes to Prohibition.
Exactly.
So that's it. Unless there's anybody else has a question.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, we can break.
I'm kidding. But we do want to go in with this, and so we have. So basically, for those of you who haven't, who don't know exactly, Brad did an exhibit called Decade of Change, and I did an exhibit called Sharps and Marks, and so this presentation is about both those exhibits. So what I'm doing first is Brad put together a series of slides that relate to the exhibit that he did. So I just want to go through a lot of them and just talk about kind of what he chose. And so you'd mentioned particularly Prohibition.
Yeah.
So the 1920s, there are certain very broad themes and very kind of broad stereotypes about the 1920s. It's the Jazz Age, there's the land boom in Florida, and you have both Prohibition and then the complete flouting of Prohibition laws. And so take that, from there, tell us about Prohibition, and particularly in Tampa and the Tampa area in Florida.
Yeah, so Prohibition is kind of one of those fun topics, but it has a lot of dark antecedents that a lot of people don't realize, and so I kind of wanted to walk the line when I put the exhibit together. One thing I'm going to do as Rodney goes through some of my slides these are all objects that I either put in the show or I couldn't put in the show, and I'll tell you why I couldn't put them in the show. So this one didn't get in the show, but I wanted to share it with you. This is a postcard. I believe, Rodney, it's from 1905, early 1900s, maybe 1901. But I liked this one because it speaks to the Prohibition movement. And what we see in the 1900s is, we were talking about the women's right to vote. One place where there's a lot of support for women's right to vote is in the Prohibition movement. And there's a lot of women that are prohibitionists. Some of them are very famous. Like out in the Midwest, there was a woman named Carrie Nation, and she was known as the bulldog at Jesus' feet, because she would walk in with a hatchet and she would break bottles in these bars, right? In Florida, we also have a powerful prohibition movement. We see support for prohibition. We see support for the Anti-Saloon League, which is founded in 1893. And can you take us to the next slide, Rodney?
Absolutely, yeah.
That brings me to another one I couldn't put in the show, but I'll share it with you today. This is another prohibitionist postcard that was printed in the early 1900s. And the reason I liked this one, Rodney, and maybe if I do a show in the 20s in the future, I'll be able to get it in, is it speaks to what the Anti-Saloon League used to argue here in Florida and throughout the nation. And it was this: the problem with saloons is it takes men out of the domestic sphere. It gets them to drink in public, gamble at saloons, and as this one indicates also, There's beat girls. There's sometimes prostitution at these places. So the Anti-Saloon League said it's not just the alcohol, right? Even though that becomes the lubricant for these as they deem them sinful things, right? But it's the saloon that's the problem. And thus, Rodney, it's not surprising that what happens in Florida is before we have statewide prohibition, there's an outlawing of saloons. We see that a few years before prohibition is actually enforced here in the Bay Area.
And then, of course, the irony of all this is that rather than getting men out of bars during Prohibition, you actually put women in speakeasies.
Yeah.
And so you have, really a more multi-gender, both men and women drinking out in public.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the early Prohibition saloons, a lot of times they were off limits for, and I use this word very carefully, but it's what they would say at the time, respectable women, right? But then the 1920s starts to change that, and we see more women out in the public sphere. And it's not just with drinking, it's also with occupations, it's at colleges. It's a real important moment for the history of women in the public sphere, the 1920s, that is.
And, there's more, again, Prohibition related items within the show. And the one thing I do, this is a great item from our collection, the White Rose Saloon. Before we get into sloppy nets, so you mentioned Prohibition taking hold in Florida before it takes place nationally. Mm-hmm. So who is the state champion for Prohibition?
Well, there's a couple of them, right? I mean, can we go back just real quick, Rodney, if you don't mind?
We can, yeah. To the newspaper?
Yeah, let's go to that. So that's from 1893, just to give you an idea. This is a Prohibitionist newsletter that was published in Polk County. And so you have earlier supporters of Prohibition. And then, just so you know, most counties, I think 26 counties, Rodney, in 1904 are already dry. So Florida becomes dry in fits and starts. But I think who you might be talking about is here in Tampa, it's a judge known as Leo Stallnacher, who is really a big-time supporter of Prohibition. He's known as the minute judge. He has really short trials. He's handing out huge fines, and he's handing out jail time for a lot of people that come in on Prohibition charges into his courtroom, which was right next to, I believe, Rodney, was right next to police department headquarters.
Yeah,
might even adjoin the police department headquarters.
Exactly. But also thinking of the governor.
Oh, the governor, Sidney Katz.
Yes.
Yeah, how can I forget? And I think I have a campaign poster of him, if we don't mind skipping ahead a little bit.
Yeah, we can buzz through here a little bit.
Yeah, we'll go back.
Yeah, we'll go back.
Oh, maybe I took Katz out.
I thought you did.
No, there he is.
There he is.
Oh, this is great. Let's go back real quick. So this is in the show. I got it. One thing we do here, I'll give you a little curatorial insight, is if we want to tell stories and we don't have objects, we'll reach out to other institutions to try to find objects. And so I reached out to the State Archives of Florida for this Katz campaign poster. And as you can see, it says, "The cat, the Catholics, and the whiskey men are fighting." So a few things Katz really supported. Number one, anti-Catholicism. He said Catholicism is bad for Americanism, and he accused the monks up at St. Leo Abbey for being murderous and doing all these terrible things. Number two, he was a hardcore supporter of Jim Crow and lynch law. He would not come out against lynchings here in Florida. And then number three, he was a Prohibition supporter. He's a big-time Prohibitionist. And he's governor, actually, he gets elected, Rodney, in 1916.
Yeah.
And his term ends right at the beginning in 1920. But he kind of sets the tone for some of these difficult topics that we talk about in the show, not just Prohibition, but also the rise of the Ku Klux Klan at the time. He's sort of a tacit supporter of the Klan and some of the racial disparities that we see during the era of Jim Crow.
And also unusual in that he was a third-party candidate.
Oh, yeah, he's the only one. This is how powerful Prohibition was in Florida. I'm glad you're bringing this up. A lot of Democrats were wet, right? They were against Prohibition, and actually, I think it's in the 1920 election, or 1928, Hoover wins Florida because Floridians, a lot of them, refused to vote for Al Smith because, number one, he's Catholic, and number two, he's anti-Prohibition. So to your point, Rodney, Katz runs on a Prohibition ticket, and he's one of the few politicians that's not a Democrat to win a Florida election around this time.
Yeah, he wasn't part of the kind of the machine that existed at the time, so he had to run as a third party.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's go back, though.
Yeah.
And so this is fun. Here we are.
Yeah.
So we won't go through every one of these slides as in depth, but you have to talk about sloppy gnats and our safe.
Yeah, so this is a fun piece that we have on display, and give you a little insider information. We got a call about a year and a half ago, Rodney, from somebody living in original Carrollwood. And they were like, I have this safe that my family, Mike Guglio, owned it in Sloppy Nate's Cafe, which was in Ybor City. He's like, it's kind of got a dark history, but we can't move it anymore, so we thought you'd be interested in it. Well, this is a safe from probably the #1 narcotics trafficking spot in Tampa in the 1920s. For those of you that know something about Tampa history, you might know Charlie Wall, who was a well-known, all kinds of things, right? Bolita, narcotics, gambling. And it's at Sloppy Nate's where a woman named Knowles basically charges Charlie Wall with selling morphine and narcotics to her. And so there's this really interesting trial at the end of the 1920s with Charlie Wall, Mike Guglio, and some other people that are involved in the narcotics trade here in Tampa. So this is the one time as the curator, Rodney, I got super excited. I'm like, oh, we can put the safe on display. I don't know when else we're going to be able to do this.
Exactly, yeah.
So we rolled it out.
Yeah. It's empty, by the way.
Yeah. We couldn't get it open. We were trying to get
I know,
it open.
it was open. We just see it was empty, but now we can open it again.
Yeah.
So now we're into swimwear and fashion in general.
Yeah. So it was really important for us, and this is one of the fun parts of the 1920s, and I'll say this, it was, we wanted to work hard to balance it, to talk about Prohibition, some of what we call the funner aspects of history with some of the darker aspects. So fashion, we said, well, let's do something fun. And so I went through, we had a couple flapper dresses that I really didn't like for the purposes of this show, but we had 2 swimsuits. And so what you'll see in the show is the 20s is a very revolutionary time. Women in particular go from wearing stockings and bloomers and shoulders, as you can see, to more risque suits. A lot of people weren't happy about this. In 1917, the Association of Park Superintendents passed regulations that skirts should be no more than 2 inches above the knee. But they also said men's chests need to be covered. And what you see from suits in the 1920s is they're very androgynous. And 2 of the suits that we have on display, at first I said, well, this one's a women's suit because it was in our catalog like that, and this one's a men's suit. And then we really looked at them, and I'm like, I don't think so. And then the one that has little cutouts on the side there, we reached out to a fashion design historian, and she's like, I actually think that's a men's suit. And so it's really interesting. It speaks to kind of the androgyny of the 1920s. And, one of the flapper stereotypes and cliches, which you've probably heard, because it's true, is that flapper attire tended to do the opposite of what corsets did, right? The idea is to push the breast down, to be more streamlined, and we see that in the androgyny of some of these suits. So it was really cool for us to put these 2 bathing suits on display.
Even the hairstyles, the bob and things like that.
Yeah. That's a good example. Those are women on Miami Beach in 1926, which is a photo I borrowed from the State Archives of Florida for this show.
All right. So, and one thing I will say is we didn't do it so much here, but in the gallery, if you all haven't seen it yet, all of the themes in the show have some really neat 1920s slang in them. And so you didn't continue that so much here. We did a little bit, but like for clothes, it was, what'd you have?
Yeah, so what we did was we have like an idiom or saying for each section. So originally I wanted the exhibit to be called Know Your Onions, Florida in the 1920s, but that got vetoed because I don't have as much power as you think. But know your onions means to know the many layers of a thing, right? And I was like, well, that's fun. So even though we didn't use it for our title, when you get to fashion, it's glad rags. When you get to Prohibition, it's hooch. When you get to agriculture, it's berries, which is something delightful. That was the most difficult one for me to find. And then when the show closes, it's let's blouse, which is to leave a place, which we all now use on the 4th floor. We're like, all right, let's blouse. Let's get out of here.
And so here we are with music and dance. So tell us a little bit, particularly, we can kind of go into this guy, Tampa Red.
Tampa Red. So the 1920s is kind of this golden age of jazz and blues. And probably the most famous musician that comes out of Tampa is Hudson Whitaker, better known as Tampa Red. He becomes a very famous jazz musician in the 1920s and 30s, and one of his big hits he writes here when he's still in Tampa, it's called It's Tight Like That. And when you go to the gallery, you can actually hear the song. We set up an interactive, you can press it, and you can hear Tampa Red playing. So we have that piece, Rodney, which is fun, and then the other piece you had just showed is the Tampa Steps Out sheet music. And for those of you that are super nerds like me about Florida history, you might be geeked out to learn that in the 1920s, you have a lot of local sheet music that gets written. This celebrates the growth of Tampa between 1880 and 1920s. There's a sheet music just on the Gandy Bridge. There's sheet music called On Miami Shores. So the idea is you would come and vacation in Florida, and you would also dance to Florida tunes, the foxtrots and some other famous dances at the time.
And if you go to the gallery, you can actually dance. We have a dance floor with the steps of the foxtrot, so you can rent the foxtrot.
Yeah, I like to torture our visitors, so I always like to have some type of interactive that they can try to do. So for our Cuba show, I had bongo drums, and I had sheet music on the wall, and I would walk through the gallery and watch them all flail and fail, which is exactly what I did when I tried to play them. So what we did is we built a 6x6 foot dance floor, and there's vinyl footsteps. So when you play You Better Keep Baby and Baby, which was a popular foxtrot, you're invited once it starts to try to do the dance. And it's just one thing we like to do as the curators, Rodney, to try to engage people in different types of ways.
Exactly. So tourism, let's talk a little bit about that.
Tourism, so 20s is kind of the early golden age of touring Florida by car. You know, before the 1920s, most tourists came by train. There's still a lot that come by train in the 1920s, but almost all of them came by train. And then the number one thing people like to do, Rodney, I think a lot of people don't know this, is to get on a paddle wheel steamer and go down into the interior of Florida, in particular, go to Silver Springs. That was Florida's number one vacation destination. In the 1920s, it's different. People start what they called at the time gypsying around the state. And so when you're in a car, you can go wherever you want. And of course, you need somewhere to park the car. So the 20s is the beginning of the first motorist camps. And one of the first is right here in Tampa at DeSoto Park. So one thing we have on display are the rules and a short history that was written in 1919 of some of the goings on at the camp. And, you know, these tin canners got a bad rap, Rodney. You know, the joke, you guys may have heard this, is that the tin canners come to Florida with a $20 bill and one pair of underwear, and they never change either of them. That was always the knock on the tin canners, if you've ever heard that before. Which is true. I mean, they're frugal, right? These are normal people, most of them coming down on inexpensive automobiles like Model Ts. But they are bringing money and attention to the economy, and in 1925 alone, there's 2.5 million tourists that come to Florida. So you have a lot of people starting to pour in.
All right, now to recreation, sports.
Sports. So, you know, one of the things that happens when we do shows is things always get left out that I want in. And so with sports, it was really difficult. And it's ironic, it became like the shortest part of the exhibit. And you'll see that if you go see the exhibit, because a lot of times when I'm frustrated with what I can't do, I'll just keep it short. So what I decided with sports is let's talk about three things, Rodney. Let's talk about golf, let's talk about baseball, and let's talk about tennis. And so those are the three sports that we chronicle. And the reason is, we had talked about women being out in the public sphere, Rodney, earlier on in this talk. Women really take to the links and to the tennis courts in the 1920s. And it becomes this other public space where women can exist and be respectful. You know, there's a reason why one of the love interests in The Great Gatsby is a golfer, right? Because it speaks to, you know, women really taking to golf at the time. And then the other thing is, before the 1920s, sure, you have some baseball teams and things like that, but this is really the beginning of Americans, I would argue, modern sporting culture, where they're hitting the links, where they're playing tennis, and you have all these baseball teams. And then, of course, the professional teams, which you know a lot more about than I do, Rodney, but this is the era of the dead ball era ends, there's more home runs, there's Babe Ruth. Actually, in the show, we have a baseball signed by Babe Ruth on display. And baseball becomes a more welcoming, in a sense, spectator sport.
Exactly, and you included a slide of the Pepsi-Cola Giants.
Oh, the Pepsi-Cola Giants, yeah. So, of course, this is during the era of Jim Crow, and the Pepsi-Cola Giants are a Negro League team here in Tampa. And the reason we highlighted them is they have a really long run. They get founded in the 1920s. This picture is actually from 1940, Rodney, but it's the only picture of the team I could find to tell the Pepsi Cola Giants history, because it's a really interesting sporting history in Florida. As you know, there was Negro leagues that just played in the state. They were kind of semi-pro leagues. And then you had broader leagues that played in the region. Pepsi Cola Giants, I think Rodney spent a lot of time in Cuba, didn't they?
Yeah, and a lot of these teams would go back and forth between Cuba and then the Southeast and play in the Southeast. But yeah, because of segregation, you did have these two separate leagues. You had a white league and a black league.
Is that picture taken in front of the old stadium on North Boulevard?
Yes, that is where that picture was taken. And not to get too far, afield with this, oftentimes in Negro League teams, the kind of local minor league teams couldn't play at white ballparks. Sometimes they could, So sometimes they're able to play Cascaden or play on North Boulevard, but more often than not, they'd be playing at where Belmont Heights Little League is, which is the same ball field but oriented differently, or same property but oriented differently. And sometimes early on, probably actually during the 20s, there was a ball field at McFarland Park, same place where West Tampa Little League is, but again, different footprint.
All right.
And going from there actually is a good transition for skipping cats, because we talked about
Yeah,
it,
we talked about cats.
to Jim Crow.
Yeah, but of course, Katz, I had mentioned earlier, is a supporter of Jim Crow and white supremacy. He really runs on that. When he's pressed after a lynching in 1920 a little earlier, it was at the end of World War II, I think 1918, to basically make a public statement about a lynching in Florida, he refuses to do so, and he writes back, and he basically says, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. And it speaks to the fact that this is the era of Jim Crow. And here in Tampa, one of the most important things that happens in the 1920s is in 1927, Benjamin Mays is the primary author of a study called A Study of Negro Life in Tampa. And this is a really nice snapshot because we don't have as many artifacts from the black community in the 1920s. It talks about education, it talks about housing, it talks about medical facilities, it talks about everything that's going on in the community. And probably most famously, it points out that there's not one public park that's open to black Tampa residents. That's why Rogers Park is later built, but it's not built until the 1950s, I think,
Yeah,
Rodney, early
it's over
1950s.
20 years after the Urban League report comes out.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about, it's not a good 20 show if we don't talk about some of these things. The burning of the community of Rosewood, the violence around the election of 1920, especially in Ocoee. The black community in Ocoee is burned down to the ground, and there's several murders after a black man tries to cast a ballot. And so the 1920s, as we said before, is this era of fashion, fun, and dance, but it's also an era of violent politics, especially when it comes to the Jim Crow system.
Yeah. Alrighty, so again, we couldn't talk about the 1920s without talking about architecture, and
Yeah.
so we talk about that quite a bit.
And I think I'll just mention it briefly, Rodney, because you'll probably do some when we talk about the land boom.
Yeah.
But, in Tampa today, when you go around, some of the most, recognizable buildings are in two styles, right? We have bungalows, a lot of them built in the 1920s, and then we have MedRev. And of course, Rodney's an expert on Davis Islands. He literally wrote the book on Davis Islands. And in Davis, this is a home from Davis Islands, actually, Rodney, as you know. It becomes one of these centerpieces of MedRev style. And there's a guy named Addison Meisner, I think his name is, who's down in Boca Raton, who really brings Spanish colonial and Mediterranean Rev style to the Bay Area. Or I'm sorry, to Florida, South Florida in particular for him.
Exactly. And then one of our classic buildings.
Oh, so this is fun. So sometimes there's really cool things in our collection that I really want to put on display, and Rodney really wants to put on display, but we just can't. And then occasionally it pops up. Well, we have the original blueprints from the Tampa Theater. We have about 8 of them in total. They're really big. At first I wanted to put 3 on display, and our curator of collections is like, you're going to take up the whole space. You can't do that. But since it's such an elaborate MedRev structure on its interior, we decided to put up one of the blueprints. So if you're an architectural nerd, or you like such things, it's really cool. We have that, and then right next to it is the souvenir program from opening day in 1926. So you get a real good sense of how, the Tampa Theater is part of the MedRev movement.
There you go. And then, this is probably your favorite part of the show,
This is my favorite part of the show. I geek out about this. How many times in our careers are we going to be able to build a revival tent, Rodney?
Very few.
Probably not.
Very few.
So this was really important to me because one thing I like to do is try to tell stories that a lot of people forget about, at least at some point in the story. And so people know about the Scopes trial, which is the famous monkey trial in Tennessee where the biology teacher, is tried for teaching evolution. In Florida, this has a lot of traction. The 1920s is an era of growing Christian fundamentalism. That's part of the force that pushes against evolutionary teachings, and charismatic Christianity, particularly in the Pentecostal tradition, right? Speaking in tongues, ecstatic worship, energetic worship, all those types of things. And so I said, that story doesn't get told a lot, so let's tell that story. So we built a revival tent, like the facade of one. And then, we tell the story about Billy Sunday coming to town. Amy McPherson was a very famous Pentecostal preacher who had a big worship center. She called it a temple out in Los Angeles. And then the last thing I'll say, Rodney, and then we can transition. I didn't get to talk about this in the show, so I'll just make y'all listen to me. Leo Stallnacher, who we talked about was a Prohibition judge and supporter, he was the minute judge. He's also the member of something called the Florida Purity League. And what the Florida Purity League does in 1927 is they reach out to the local schools, and in particular, the University of Florida and the Florida Women's College, now known as Florida State, and try to ban books. They tried to ban H.G. Wells' history that he wrote. Oh, the title escapes me. Any work by Sigmund Freud, they can't stand. They tried to ban that. And a book called Elementary Biology, which lays out basic evolutionary theory. At the University of Florida, the president acquiesces and builds like a cage behind the reference desk, and only certain professors and students can get those books. At Florida State, Florida Women's College, the president pushes back. And so what you see with this is, some of the things you see today, and that's kind of the interesting thing about the 20s. In some ways, they're kind of marrying some of the political disagreements that we're seeing in the United States today. But it also highlights how people like Stallnacher that supported Prohibition tended to support other causes, fundamental Christianity, anti-evolutionary thought. And Stallnacher even says, and I'll finish with this, Rodney, he goes, if getting educated is going to ruin my child's faith, I don't want them to be educated. So it's this really interesting, this religious and prohibition movements are all tied in together.
There you go.
Yeah, so, it's my turn.
Now it's your turn.
Yeah.
So, see, you used let's blouse as one of his...
Oh, let's blouse.
Yeah.
So that means to leave a place.
But don't.
Yeah, don't leave yet, but I assume y'all will all adopt that. So as Rodney answered, but don't drift just yet. So my job with my show is kind of do the 20s kind of writ large in Florida. And then Rodney decided, well, what he was going to do with our extensive map collection, which I think we have several thousand at this point. Are we close to 10,000?
Yeah, probably 8,000 now.
Or 8,000. Is he wanted to do a land boom show. And so we have a bunch of different maps. And so I guess, Rodney, to kind of start off, why the land boom? Like, why bother? And then why this piece?
So why bother? So the land boom is really one of the biggest events to happen in Florida in the 20th century. It's kind of what made South Florida exist to some degree. You have whole cities in the state that were created in the 1920s. Coral Gables down in the Miami area, Temple Terrace here, and then whole communities within cities that were also created during this time. Davis Islands Beach Park, but then Miami Beach itself, though it predates World War I a little bit and predates the land boom a little bit, it really came to its own during the 1920s through the work of Carl Graham Fisher and others. Again, places like Boca Raton, so many places that we think about as kind of synonymous with Florida, whether it's architecture or leisure or wealth or what have you, got their start or grew tremendously during this time. The population itself, grew tremendously. We had less than 1 million people living in Florida in 1920, and that's we have more than 1 million people living in Hillsborough County today. So the population of our county today was larger than the entire state 100 years ago. By 1930, that population had grown to almost 1.5 million people. So we added about 500,000 people just in that 10-year period, a tremendous time of growth. And so that story really needs to be told. And then you have the other side of it, which is that scammer side, which really kind of almost like the birth of Florida Man kind of during this time period, because of all these swindlers who were here. And Brad had his problem with his title of Know Your Onions. I had my own title problems. The exhibit is called Sharps and Marks in Paradise, and Sharps are the swindlers and Marks are the people they're swindling. But I can tell you guys, because you are an adult audience, you can handle this. My original title was something with the word Binder Boys. And Binder Boys were actually really some of these main swindlers. And what they would do, in the main way in the mid-20s that real estate was sold, is you wouldn't buy a piece of land or you get a mortgage for a piece of land. You would buy what's called a binder. And that binder was good for 30 days. And what it did was basically allowed you the right to purchase a piece of land in 30 days. So you bought this binder for about 10% of the value of the property. And you had within that 30 days your opportunity to sell that binder if you wanted to. and then someone else who could sell that binder. And it kind of rolls and rolls and rolls. At the end of 30 days, the person holding onto it is now stuck with this property. And so you had this paper wealth being built around these binders. And particularly in Miami, you had people who were selling these binders called binder boys. Well, it turns out in the 21st century, binder boy has a different connotation that has to do with gender changing and things like that. So we couldn't use the word binder boys for the title because it means something entirely different. And people coming to see the exhibit will be coming to look for something entirely different than what we had intended them to see.
Titles are tricky.
So titles are tricky. And then more to the point with this map, Brad mentioned early the idea of the car. You know, automobiles were, in the 20s, what, again, those steamships and the trains were in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what the automobile does, because you all, have cars, you all drive, it's freedom. It allows you to go more where you want to go. You're not confined to the currents of a river, or you're not confined to really the steel rails of a train. When people arrived in Florida through Flagler or Plant's railroads, you were pretty much stuck going to the towns along those rail routes and then staying in the hotels that are adjacent. But what the automobile did is it allowed you to kind of take off into the countryside. We used to call it gypsying, is what you said.
Yeah.
And so kind of commensurate with that after World War I was the kind of larger scale construction of roads, but not just by the government, whether it's the state or federal government or even municipalities, but private individuals built roads, or private individuals and investment firms built roads. So the Gandy Bridge is the best local example. George Gandy had an investment company that built the bridge, and then you paid a toll to go over that bridge, and that money for the toll went into the investment company's pockets, and that was that way until World War II. The Dixie Highway is probably the best example for Florida, and that was built largely by Carl Graham Fisher and his company. And Fisher was also the one who created Miami Beach. Again, he was the one who promoted, I should say, Miami Beach to the best part. And actually, Brad and I were talking about one of his promotions was a water skiing elephant. He was one of these guys who really was, D.P. Davis learned a lot from Carl Graham Fisher. And again, it's no surprise, again, much like Flagler and Plant, that the Dixie Highway goes straight down the east coast of Florida and ends in Miami, just across the Biscayne Bay from Miami Beach. And so he was also bringing people into Florida. This map talks a little bit about road construction, but we got a better one that I think is one of Brad's favorites. We'll save that one. We'll go to this real quick. So the land boom wasn't just a story that was in local papers or state papers or the national papers. It was an international event. People from around the world were learning about the land boom. This is actually a page from a story from a London magazine talking about the land boom. And you can see in the top right where a newsboy made 3.6 million pounds selling real estate. Probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but maybe not too much of one. And it's interesting, too, in its use of very accurate depictions for the time of minorities. There's the top right cartoon talks about a porter on a train giving advice or talking about a land deal to passengers. And so African Americans took very limited part, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, very limited part in the land boom, but there was a role for that as well. And then the bottom, there's a depiction of Seminoles. And this is kind of the not so good side of it, not the Seminoles so much, but the Seminole is talking to these people who bought some land in the Everglades, and they're finding out that the land is underwater, because there was a lot of that. We actually have a great manuscript map on display where this guy wrote a letter and drew a map to these people who own land, and they asked him to go find it, basically. And it was 30 miles into the Everglades. It's 90 acres of land. And he says in the letter that this land is great, it's very fertile, but it's worth nothing because there's no way to get to it. I mean, he said, I had to take a car and a boat and then this, that, and the other just to get to the land to actually see it. So someday it'll be worth something, but right now, not so much.
Yeah. So the automobile could get you most places. You could gypsy around. It democratized coming to Florida, but it couldn't get you everywhere.
It could not get you to the Everglades,
Couldn't
that's for
get
sure.
you to the land that you purchased.
Yeah.
Did you want to go back, Rodney?
No,
or would you like to do
no,
this?
go to that one.
Okay. This is one of my favorite. I'm going to jump in real quick if that's all right. I got to watch Rodney give a talk about the map show yesterday, and I didn't realize this until he pointed it out, but this is a really interesting map because it shows you what surface the roads are made of, whether they're asphalt, they're concrete, and as you'll see, Rodney, I don't want to steal your thunder,
No, go
but
ahead.
I thought the most interesting thing was you cannot drive all the way down the East Coast on an asphalt road.
Exactly. If you go back to, you can see the map with the red roads. And if you look at that map, you think, well, that's, pretty good. Florida has a pretty extensive road system. But if you go to the other one, which was actually published by the Jacksonville Times-Union, the newspaper in Jacksonville, you really see the condition of things in 1923. And that condition's not that great. And as Brad mentioned, the Dixie Highway existed, but you had to take a lot of detours around the roads. So they used three different types of type or print to indicate the quality of roads. And the darkest, which is probably easiest for you all to see, are the best quality roads, made of either brick, asphalt, or what's something called oiled rock, which, didn't sound that great to me, but apparently it was really good. And you can see where those roads are located, most of them coming to Tampa. Because Tampa at this time, certainly if you talk about Tampa in the kind of greater metro area such as it was, which would include West Tampa, which was still a separate city, Port Tampa City, which was still separate, places like Palmacia and Virginia Park, and even, I guess at this point, some of Seminole Heights were all outside of the city limits. If you included those, what we think of as Tampa in the census, Tampa would have been the largest city in Florida at this time. And so in this map, really kind of proves that point, because not all roads, but many roads lead to Tampa. Miami at this time was still starting to kind of gain traction, but it wasn't as big as Tampa. And Jacksonville, and really North Florida at this time was a pass-through. And so later the land boom makes it back up there with D.P. Davis going to St. Augustine and starting a land development, but it ultimately fails. And you really see the land boom starting in South Florida and growing out, but as far as having any great effect, really it's the Miami area, South Florida, up to Fort Lauderdale, and then the Tampa Bay area, a little bit in Orlando, and that's really it. And so the roads, as you see, kind of go with that to some degree. So if you need to have a really sturdy car to get around the dashed lines.
Yeah, so this was one of my favorites, and there's some other good ones here. I was hoping when we asked y'all to write questions that somebody would ask, how did Carl Fisher get an elephant on Miami Beach? Like, how did he actually get the thing there? Yeah. So my question to you, Rodney, is where was the elephant in this map?
Well, so the elephant is not in this map. This is the earliest map of what we know as Miami Beach. As far as being developed. This was called Ocean Beach, and this map is a pre-World War I map, but 1913 thereabouts. And while you see no elephants in this map, you actually see airplanes, which is really early. And as far as Tom and I have done some research, the earliest, and kind of it's a quirky thing to try to look into, but the earliest map of any area that also has airplanes depicted on it, and they were trying to show, I think to some degree, a level of innovation and kind of progressivism within this, but also in a kind of sport and that type of thing. Because not only is there an airplane featured prominently in the upper left, there actually are airplanes on the beach. And that's, there's like a little runway they'd had set up. And this was, again, this was what became South Beach in Miami. The Bindle and Anderson Company was the original developers of it. Ultimately, though, it was Fisher, along with the Collins brothers, who really developed Miami Beach. And the Collins brothers are kind of Miami locals, and they own a tremendous amount of the barrier island that became Miami Beach. And so it was their kind of land, in a sense, and a little bit of their money, but also Fisher's money, because he was a millionaire coming into Florida, that birthed Miami Beach. And part of it is Fisher's eye for promotion, but also the idea of enlarging the land and sculpting the land in a way that fits the development. Because as the name implies, Miami Beach is a beach, and so there's a shoreline that goes into the water. But what they did is they built bulkheads and they dredged land in to create more land, but also solid land so you can go all the way up to the water with your development. And so that sculpting of land and that kind of dramatic promotion was really set the stage for what happened in the rest of Florida during the land boom. And Fisher and Collins were the ones really who did it first.
Yeah, the dredges do a lot of work. I mean, they build Miami Beach, they build Davis Islands, which I know you're going to talk about, Rodney. They drain the Everglades. I mean, the
Yeah.
dredge might be the most important piece of machinery, maybe short of the Model T, I think, in Florida in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Coral Gables, another South Florida example. So, Brad, you'd mentioned Meisner and Boca Raton, and it was Meisner and Boca, and it was Merrick and Coral Gables who really did set that look. So if Fisher was the person who kind of set the bar for promotion, it was people like Meisner and Merrick, and then Merrick's design partner, a man named Phineas Paste, who really created the look of the Florida land boom, that Mediterranean revival style, the kind of exotic nature that was, a complete departure from the bungalow, which was still very prevalent in the 20s, but actually had already kind of taken a foothold in Florida in the teens. But you're going entirely away from that. You're going with block, for the most part, block construction rather than wood construction, a stucco exterior. But lots of tile, lots of flat roofs, which aren't really that great in Florida. And then
But they look cool.
They look great.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a smaller porch. Sometimes, exchanging a porch for a kind of little plaza in the middle of the property. But you're really creating an exotic look. And much like the bungalow, from the American standpoint, the MedRev comes from California. And so these guys see what's going on in California, and they bring that over here. But it's really, again, particularly Phineas Paste with Coral Gables is somebody that you don't really hear a whole lot about. And one quick note about Merrick. Merrick owns the Coral Gables property, and originally it's a farm. He has citrus groves and bananas and pineapples and things like that, and he's selling both the product of the farm, but also seedlings and things to other people. But he realizes, seeing what's going on just a little bit to the east, that he can really make more money if he sells his land, not just the products of the land. So he creates Coral Gables to do so.
Yeah, these were huge projects, and the characters too. Like Fisher was famous for his partying and his gallivanting.
Yeah.
I mean, these developers were really interesting folks. Which brings brings us to one of your favorite topics,
Exactly.
your friend D.P. Davis.
Yeah, settle in, everybody, and talk about it. We'll be kind of brief about this. But Davis Islands is really Tampa's Miami Beach. Not in the sense of the glamour, but certainly in the sense of the scale and the scope and the level of promotion for a 1920s neighborhood or development. But also, just the use of dredges. There are lots of 1920s developments where they would kind of dredge the edges. They would take a piece of land that's on the mainland, but close to the water, and then they would kind of dredge up that lowland to make everything even so you could build on the whole property. But what D.P. Davis did is he basically saw two little mud flats in Hillsborough Bay and created Davis Islands. And again, he lived in and worked in Miami as a real estate broker in the early 1920s. He had to have seen and known Fisher and what he did in Miami Beach. And so he came here. There's some evidence that a man named Berks Hamner, who was also a really big real estate developer in the 20s in Tampa, had the idea for Davis Islands, but he didn't have the ability to pull it off. But he either knew D.P. Davis or kind of knew of him and got him interested in it. And so really it's the anniversary of Davis Islands, which is January 1924 when the idea came about, or the announcement came about, that prompted me to want to have a land boom show at this time. And it worked well that we could do the 20s at the same time. But the thing about Davis Islands is it was a boom time area that made Davis incredibly rich, and then it basically made him broke, and then made him kill himself. So it's a very kind of boom and bust cycle with Davis. And if you want to know more, just read the book.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to go to the St. Augustine one, but is
yeah,
that
I
one
didn't use that. So really, what made Davis go broke was he got a little full of himself, and he realized that he sold all his property in Davis Islands, made really millions of dollars, although on paper mostly. And he went to St. Augustine, to Anastasia Island, to create Davis Shores. Davis Islands was always billed as a $30 million development and had a 9-hole golf course and 2 hotels and these different things. Davis Shores was going to be a $60 million development, an 18-hole championship golf course, 5 grand hotels. and he spent a fortune on it. And he eventually sold Davis Islands to keep financing Davis Shores, but everything was just falling apart at that time, and so ended in his death.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Which
Sad
we-
ending.
Yeah, it was a sad ending for DP. So here's one. Maybe we can
So
just
Beach
do
Park.
quick,
Yeah, we do
Rodney,
quick
which
Beach
is-
Park.
Beach Park.
Again, that's on the, of course, for those of you who don't know, on the west end of what we now know as South Tampa on the Inner Bay Peninsula. Interestingly, outside of the city limits until 1953. Another development, it's a great example of one of those developments. This was T. Roy Young and other partners creating a neighborhood, platting the streets. This is a landscape map, particularly, landscaping that. But then you only have a handful of homes that are actually built. And so this happens in Davis Islands, happens really everywhere. But it set up the infrastructure for the second great 20th century land boom, which was after World War II. And so you have lots of these empty lots being sold, either by municipalities who took them for taxes or by the people who are holding on to them in the 50s. And rather than having med revs built on them, you have these ranch-style homes built on them. And all these lots, this is really kind of the birth of a few different things. One of them, they got away from a grid. So you think about pre-1920s neighborhoods, they're almost always in a grid pattern, north, south, east, west streets. In the 20s, they started using, lots of curves, lots of different shapes for the properties. But generally speaking, even though there are curved streets and not straight streets, they also stick to a pretty close 50-foot wide lot. And it fit the style of both bungalows and med revs because they were kind of long, slender houses. But in the 50s, the ranch goes the opposite direction. They're wide. And because of property values and because of architectural styles, people are buying double lots and building two houses or building one house on two lots because that's the way it fits. The economy works that way. Now, of course, we're seeing those houses being purchased, torn down, the lots split again. But that's kind of the full circle for these lots.
Yeah, kind of like fashion and everything else, it's kind of this revolutionary decade, right, where they're changing these stylings.
Exactly.
And-
And quickly, we'll go here. So this is the other Seminole Heights. Of course, we have Seminole Heights here in Tampa. This is the version in Lakeland. And this is one of those developments that never really took off. And I like this because Nick Burns, I hope no one's related to Nick Burns in this audience, because Nick Burns seems to be one of those sharps, a guy who really was doing it just for the money, not really caring about the development. There is a plat for his Seminole Heights on the back of this map, but you can see very clearly he's a prophet. And so he's not a prophet, but it's all about the prophet. And this is important. And so you wouldn't know normally, the map of Polk County is kind of ordinary, no offense to our friends in Polk County. But it's hard for you all to see, but if you go to the exhibit, you'll see. Just south of Lakeland, there is a little town that doesn't really exist anymore. And it's called Christina. You can go to the next slide. And I'd mentioned that African Americans, Brad, aren't really that involved in the land boom. But there was at least one, and there may have been a couple others, but I've never found them. But there is at least one development that was devoted for African Americans in the land boom, and that was the town of Christina. Of course, segregated, but it was, a place where blacks could invest and they could, build a town of their own, which is really interesting because you don't see that. That's not the marketing of the 20s in the land boom. It's not even the kind of the ethic of the 20s in the South at the time. And it also was interesting, and this is not unusual. And you see the sign, it's a little blurry, but it says a city for colored people, and then lots and acreage for sale. And again, the lots and acreage for sale is not unusual for any kind of development in the 20s. And Temple Terrace is another great example of this. When you came in to Florida, you would buy, in these examples, not only a building lot in town, but you would basically be buying a 10 or 20 acre agricultural lot just outside of town, but within the boundaries of the development. So you could be a farmer, or you could rent out that farmland to somebody, and then drive an income, and then you could then have your in-town lot, so you could live at least seasonally in Florida. So it wasn't uncommon to do that, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is. And the only other black entrepreneur that I can think about, I think his name was Ebenezer Stirrup, maybe, down in Miami, who was acquiring, instead of being paid cash for the work that he did, he was acquiring land, and then he built some homes. But yeah, it's very rare during the land boom to see neighborhoods built specifically for black residents.
Yeah.
Oh, this is one of my favorites. So this is a fun one, and I heard Rodney talk about this one. As you guys know, there's oil everywhere in Florida. There's There's oil in the Everglades, Rodney. There's oil underneath us. There's
Right
oil.
there.
There's oil. So what's the deal with this map?
So there is a part of the show that focuses on non-subdivision parts of the land boom, agricultural being one of them, the Everglades in general, and we're going to do an Everglades exhibit in a few years. But draining of the Everglades is a very big part of Florida's 20th century history, and now we're trying to repair that. And then the search for oil in the Everglades is another part of this that takes place in the 1920s. And so the Tatum brothers, I'm sure on the up and up, selling land in the Everglades where you could invest. And they even did kind of hedge their bet a little bit. They said that, you can buy this land in the Everglades, and we're going to drill for oil, and we know there's oil in Texas, so there must be oil in Florida. But if we're wrong, it's okay, because this land has been drained, and it's great, rich muck land that you can then invest in for either growing sugarcane or citrus or any number of other things. And that really is the story of the Everglades. Beginning in 1904 with the election of Napoleon Bonaparte Broward as governor of Florida, and then the canals that are built to basically direct the flow of water out of Lake Okeechobee. Basically, Lake Okeechobee is not much deeper than this table. And any kind of rain goes into it, that water goes over the crests over the edge, and it goes in every direction. And that's how the Everglades basically is provided with the water that makes it move and makes it literally the river of grass. But that's not good if you want to have farmland over here. So what you do is you create these canals that come out of the Everglades, and there's 4 of them that all drain into the Atlantic Ocean. And that is a way to control that flooding, drain this land, and make it dry enough for farming. And so that's what has happened. That's what happens beginning in the early 1900s, but really comes to fruition in the 1920s, which works until it doesn't.
Yeah, especially in 1928, which
Exactly.
we'll probably end talking a little bit about the hurricane. Yeah,
we do in here.
So as you said, the Everglades is a dangerous place because Lake Okeechobee is a saucer, and then you have a river of water. Of course, what happens, Rodney, when a very powerful hurricane goes over that saucer and into that river of water?
It's terrible.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because the land boom is bracketed by hurricanes. 1921, and we talk about this a lot, 1921 is the last time a hurricane makes a direct hit to Tampa, the Tampa Bay area. I will say 5 years later, we decide that an island in a bay is a great place to build a hospital. And so we do that here on Davis Islands. But we totally ignore the fact that Florida is hurricane prone until we can no longer ignore that fact. And 1926 is when the first one hits, direct hit on Miami. Literally the eye crosses through downtown Miami, causes an incredible amount of destruction. Not a relatively small loss of life, but still a catastrophic storm financially, and also again it did indeed take a lot of lives. But as Brad, as you were saying, it's the 1928 storm that is the one that is literally the real killer. The 1928 storm makes landfall in West Palm Beach and cuts across the Everglades, and it brings an incredible amount of rain to the Everglades, fills that saucer as you described, and floods the Everglades. There are no real numbers on the number of deaths, but it's well over 2,000 people died in the Everglades hurricane 1928. Most of them are black agricultural workers and their families who are living in the Everglades. And again, probably needless to say, but the warning systems for hurricanes were not non-existent, but were very, very rudimentary. Basically, you'd get a telegram or telegraph or some kind of radio signal from the Bahamas or from Cuba or from Key West saying a storm has passed through here. And they would know, okay, so from just experience, if a storm passes through there at a certain time of year, the chances are it's going to go here or go there. But they really didn't know. And there was really no way to get any word out into the Everglades. I described to you the guy with 90 acres of land. These were nearly impossible to get to places. And so even though they were towns, like Clewiston or Belglade, they were very isolated. And so they had no warning at all. And you just have this incredible floodwaters come through and wash away, again, thousands of people.
Yeah, it's a very sad scene. They were concerned. There were so many bodies they didn't know what to do, so they piled them and they had to open funeral pyres in some places. So it's a very dark moment in Florida's history, and as you said, it kind of brackets the end of the boom.
It does, and that's Brackets the end of our talk.
That brackets the end of our talk.
Yeah.
So
On such a high note for you all.
yeah, that
I
was
know.
that was.